It's the economy, stupid.
This is Better Know a Policy. A few weeks ago, our Dave, dressed in his Sunday best and surrounded by golden encrusted chairs, called for the economic policy of austerity to be made permanent. Now, while austerity has led to the top 1% of the 1% doubling their wealth and earning themselves enough to pay off the entire UK deficit, it has also been used to justify a series of cuts, which, in turn, has led to an increase in worker oppression, an increase in homelessness, an increase in suicides, an increase in the national debt, and resulted in the Red Cross launching the biggest food drive in UK history since the Second World War, leaving many economists asking the question,
What the fuck is going on?
Well, to find out, it's time to take a trip down memory lane to find out how the current policy of austerity was first introduced. Meet Carmen Reinhart, former chief economist for the lovable Bear Stearns, an International Monetary Fund employee. Together with Ken Rogoff, a Harvard colleague and former IMF economist, they make the economic super team Reinhart and Rogoff, who, together in 2010, published the revolutionary paper Growth in a Time of Debt. Analysing numerous countries' economic data, Growth in a Time of Debt presented the ideology of austerity as a necessity, as opposed to a choice, with the paper finding that economic growth slows when the size of a country's debt rises above 60% of GDP, and is roughly cut in half when the size of a country's debt rises above the magic number of 90%, when negative growth will occur. Now, before we begin looking at how this paper and its economic arguments were debunked, it's worth noting that Britain's debt to GDP ratio was not close to this 90% marker at the time austerity was introduced, or that the idea that crossing this 90% threshold, which Britain has done numerous times before, means that you will suddenly see negative growth, should have meant that this paper was met with a reaction similar to this.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. May God have mercy on your soul.
But nope. Instead, this sole paper was used to justify austerity programmes around the globe, with EU Commissioner Olli Rehn and former vice presidential candidate Paul Ryan both referencing the 90% figure to support austerity. Further, our very own Lord Lamount of Earwick, a former Chancellor and senior advisor, and even Gideon himself have referenced Reinhart and Rogoff, with Mr. Osborne quoting the work of Reinhart and Rogoff in 2010 to justify cuts when he referenced the debt-related 90% figure with the statement, as Rogoff and Reinhart demonstrate convincingly, all financial crises ultimately have their origins in one thing. So, over the next 3 years, austerity based on the principles of Reinhart and Rogoff was adopted, and apart from a series of dramatic budget cuts which hit the poor, the lack of economic growth, the rise in governmental debt, and the occasional riot, things were going well. Yet, at the start of 2013, the cracks had begun to emerge, and when a grad student at the University of Massachusetts and his professors attempted to replicate the research, the findings of Rogoff and Reinhart and the principles of austerity would unravel. After numerous attempts to replicate the research, these three academics eventually received the original Excel spreadsheet used by Reinhart and Rogoff, where the following errors which completely debunked their research were discovered. The first error related to selective exclusions, with Reinhart and Rogoff somehow accidentally forgetting to include 14 years of relevant data, with information for Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, all omitted. What's notable is that these three countries, in the time periods given, all experienced high debt and solid growth, directly contradicting the claims made in Growth in a Time of Debt. The second error concerned Reinhart and Rogoff's use of unconventional weighting. Using their method, 1 year from a smaller country that supports their findings will be given the same weight as decades of data from bigger countries. Or, as an example from the paper, the UK has 19 years where its debt to GDP ratio was above 90%, with a steady average of 2.4% growth, whereas our friends in New Zealand had 1 year where their GDP ratio was above 90% and ended up with growth of minus 7.6%. Yet, these two pieces of data were weighted as the same, despite the different timescales and different results, making Reinhart and Rogoff's findings biased and ultimately flawed. The third and perhaps funniest error is their failure to use Excel properly. Yep, 2 esteemed Harvard professors failed to properly use Excel, making some critical errors in their spreadsheet, which led to 5 of the 20 countries they were looking at somehow not being included in their final calculations, with economic data for Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, and Denmark all missing. Incidentally, these countries' data all offered counter-evidence for the arguments that Reinhart and Rogoff were making. In addition to these minor errors, Reinhart and Rogoff failed to get their paper peer-reviewed at any point before publication. Now, correcting for all these errors and going off the original spreadsheet that Reinhart and Rogoff used, this time with the correct formulas and cells included, we find that the average GDP growth for countries at the magic 90% debt mark is not minus 0.1, but is in fact positive 2.2%, with average growth for high debt countries not being dramatically different than those with low debt, completely undermining the austerity argument. Anyway, leaving aside the fact that this was spotted by a student doing his homework who was able to get the original spreadsheet, Reinhart and Rogoff's work was built around a series of errors, with the intellectual argument for austerity and all the subsequent human suffering that has come with it being partly based on someone failing to update a simple formula in Excel. Still, after the public exposure of the flaws in their work, Reinhart and Rogoff together issued the following statement: "We literally just received this draft comment and will review it in due course. Nevertheless, the weight of the evidence to date seems entirely consistent with our original interpretation of the data." Unfucking believable. They even went further, rejecting any responsibility for the fact their research was used to justify austerity, and noted how they were in fact the real victims, with their feelings being hurt after people were rude to them, before bravely concluding that, "Our feelings are not what's important here." Well, why mention them then? And while they probably don't deserve the emails they've been getting, it's kinda strange that that concluding rebuttal is the only time Reinhart and Rogoff were actually right throughout this entire story. They came in for further criticism when they issued an additional statement, which caused some people to question their grip on reality. Nowhere did we assert that 90% was a magic threshold that transforms outcomes, as conservative politicians have suggested. Except the problem here is that they did. They absolutely did. Firstly, when writing as a team on Bloomberg View back in July 2011 during the famous US debt ceiling crisis debate. Then once again when they referred to it as a threshold. So not only have they produced damaging, now discredited research, but these two economic masterminds have also been caught trying to deny previous statements. It's also a good idea that if you don't want people to confuse the 90% idea as a threshold, to not refer to it as an important marker or indeed a threshold. Anyway, the debunking of both Reinhart and Rogoff and their pro-austerity paper continued, with the production of 2 new studies, these being peer-reviewed and without Excel errors, which not only further disproved their work, but found that the opposite of what Reinhart and Rogoff had concluded was true. Slow growth leads to higher debt, not the other way around. Or, to put it another way, not only does austerity hurt millions of people, but it's also going to hit generations within the UK for years to come, as debt levels have soared. They were also further debunked when a professor and student from the University of Michigan crunched their data and found not a shred of evidence to support their theory. And again, when Dean Baker, a senior figure at the Centre for Economic and Policy Research, highlighted the devastating impact that the errors within this paper have had, with the statement, "This is a mistake that had enormous consequences. If facts mattered in economic policy debates, this should be the cause for a major reassessment of the deficit reduction policies currently being pursued." So there we have it, the entire intellectual argument of austerity, and the 2 writers behind it debunked. And this whole sorry state of affairs raises 2 important points. The first being that if Reinhart and Rogoff, being from Harvard, are 2 of the best and brightest economists out there, what the hell are the stupid economists like? And secondly, As Paul Krugman argues, the entire argument of austerity has been sold on completely false pretenses, with the strongest intellectual argument for it being based on bad information and a broken Excel spreadsheet, meaning that austerity has been implemented through choice as opposed to necessity, with policymakers here in the UK and across the globe turning to austerity because they wanted to, not because they had to. Still, I'm sure those of us here in the UK can all take comfort in the words of our very own Dave, who, when talking about the Barclays LIBOR rigging scandal, commented that people have to take responsibility for their actions and show how they're going to be accountable for these actions. It's very important that goes all the way to the top of the organisation. No doubt these same principles will be applied here.
But there's something else you need to know about me, which is I believe the test of a good and strong society is how we look after the most vulnerable, the most frail, and the poorest. That's true in good times, but it's even more true in difficult times. And there will be difficult decisions, but I want to lead us through those to better times ahead. I think I've got a great team behind me. I think that we can do great things in this country.